This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. By the magic of a flight from Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, to Tokyo, Japan, to San Francisco in the United States of America, to Las Vegas. That's where you find me today, in Las Vegas at the Bellagio. Now, I have to admit, it's quite the journey, quite the hike to make it over for a conference. I won't do it all the time, but it's worth it. And you know what? I like flying on ANA. They're such an easy airline. Japanese carrier, I highly recommend them when flying into Asia and in out of Asia. Today, while I am running around Las Vegas, I want to reach back into my archives and give you something that is very special to me, an episode very special to me. This is Ed Sekota's second appearance on this podcast. My history with Ed, my meeting Ed, goes back to 2001, I believe, for the first time, on an island somewhere in the Caribbean. And before I go too far, let me remind those that are not aware, perhaps the best-selling market book of all time, The Market Wizards by Jack Schwager, features one Ed Sekota. And in that feature, it features one of the best market quotes ever. And I paraphrase a little, but everyone gets what they want out of the markets. That means if you lose a lot, you want to lose. If you win a lot, you want to win. All other things being equal, and it's a philosophical construct by Ed, and a quite brilliant one. But going back to 2001, that first meeting with Ed Sekota, it actually happened because I, in my infinite wisdom in the early days of the internet, registered the domain name edsekota.com. Now, I had no evil intent. I registered a lot of domain names. I made actually decent money off some domain names, not because of personal domains, but crazy ones like ulcer.com, pregnancytest.com. Yes, I actually registered those and made significant money. But that was the randomness of the early internet days, and that was one of the spoils. But like I said, I registered edsekota.com. I did not do anything with it. No website. Did not ask for anything. Did not reach out to anybody. It was just in my stable of domains. One day, a representative of Ed's reached out and said, "Hey, you have edsname.com. He would like it. Can he have it?" I said, "Sure." Now, in those days, you signed a piece of paper with Network Solutions, which I did, dropped it in the mail, did not ask for anything. And a few weeks later, Ed's rep said, "Hey, would you like to meet Ed and have a conversation?" I did. The rest is history. I've been fortunate to have Ed on this podcast twice. I've been fortunate to have Ed on stage in Chicago with Larry Hite. What a great moment that was. I've just been a lucky guy to have these men that came before me impart wisdom. And I think we're all lucky that someone like Ed gives back, because it's timeless stuff. I mean, you could have the guys out there that want to talk about some daily tick, some kind of nonsense, whatever. That's not the point. That's not where Ed goes. Ed goes to the big picture, the big philosophical construct that you must have to be successful in the markets or life. So it's just so damn random how life can be. Take a crazy little action like registering a domain name and then becoming friends with Ed Sekota. Now look, that particular angle, it will not work for you today in 2018. Not going to happen. You're going to have to do something else. You're going to have to be clever or interesting to reach out and meet with the people that you want to meet with. But it's doable. And it's worth it. And I think you can tell by the episode that I'm going to play right now, it's been really worth it for me. I hope you enjoy this conversation, this rebroadcast conversation with Ed Sekota. I was trying to think of an example just as we were getting on the call here, and I was thinking, and I'm not trying to pick on a particular bank or anything necessarily, but a few years ago, I read something that J.P. Morgan had made money every day in the first quarter of the year. And I was thinking, wow, is that a great example of the Gavopoly system in action? Would be one question to you. The second part of that question, though, would be, is that if there doesn't seem to be much outrage right now, and I'm wondering if the outrage, the lack of outrage, is reflected in the fact that so many average everyday people via mutual funds and perhaps pensions actually have investments in these many Gavopoly type companies. It just seems like it's a precarious situation.
Yeah, I don't want to comment on any particular banks, and I'm not sure exactly in what section you're talking about. But it's everywhere you look, everywhere there's a regulation, and there's a Gavopoly system at work, and the outrage, as you say, the outrage doesn't really occur because as the system grows, more and more people have an investment in it, and as you stop competition within a economy, the whole economy itself becomes less competitive. And we're certainly seeing that show up in our relationships with other countries, where particularly China and other countries, India and so forth, we're not competitive. The whole economy, our economy is not competitive because we don't allow ourselves to compete with one another anymore. And so we're not competitive with other countries.
I think to add to that point on the other countries, I see it being in Asia right now. It seems like that in Asia, you can build an 80-story office tower faster than sometimes perhaps you can install a fence in America.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Trying to do anything in the United States requires enormous amount of regulatory effort, and the companies have to maintain whole staffs just to comply with regulations, and all of that has got to get paid for somewhere. So they've got to eventually get to raise prices, and we're not competitive. So it's and I'm not saying any of this is bad or wrong or should be changed. In my book, I don't say that there's anything wrong. I'm just looking at how does the engine work. How does this work, and how do we explain what we've got? And I'm not trying to change anything. I'm just saying, well, this is how it works, and I need to know how it works because, as your audience does, and so do I, we try to trade, and we want to understand as best we can what's going on. So my point is not to change anything. I'm not a politician, and I'm not running for office or anything. I'm not promising any changes, or I don't have any formula for change. I'm saying this is what's happening, and you might as well take this into your personal calculus when you're playing the markets.
Well, you make a great point because you're talking to a guy that unfortunately grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, so I had to listen to too much politics. And I think there's a great video on the internet with Ray Dalio talking about the economic machine. And I think you're doing something similar, but it's your take, your research, and you're saying, hey, look, this is the machine that I see. This is the economy as I see it. And I'm not trying to give you a value judgment on it, but by all known facts and my research, the evidence lays out, this is what's happening.
Yeah, and Dalio has a wonderful video out there, and he's talking about how the economy works. Basically, his analysis, the supposition he has, we have a free economy, and those kinds of things work in a free economy. But since 1913, when we had the Fed, you'll see the free economy isn't really free to function anymore. And if you look at long-term charts up till 1913, before 1913, when we had the Fed, we had a fairly stable economy. We had blips, ups and downs, and so forth. But since the Fed's come along, it's enabled the Gavopoly system to put an effective tax rate on citizens and spend money in excess of what they can tax. There used to be a limit to government growth in the Gavopoly system. That limit was that they would have to tax people in order to fund the government. But they don't have to do that anymore. They can go to the Fed and they can get however the mechanism works, however you want to explain the mechanism. They can either, you can say they can print up money or get a line of credit or whatever. Basically, they can spend money before they tax. I've shown in my model, if you keep government spending to under about 1.5% effective asset tax, so under 1.5%, government never can grow big enough to stop the growth of the free competition sector. But once you get an effective tax rate above that, then the government will grow, and it's like it's a parasite. It's the same mathematics of a parasite, where the parasite will grow and then finally it will take over the host, or like a cancer or a parasite. The mathematics and the dynamics are the same. It stays in balance if you keep the asset tax rate under about 1.5%, but we're way over that now. And we are seeing a decline in manufacturing and in tool making, and we're consuming, or the Gavopoly system is now consuming the free competition sector. And when we run out of a free competition sector, which is imminent in my opinion, then we have a whole different economy, where you have the Gavopoly system trying to manage the free competition sector, and it can't do that. It doesn't know how to do that. It's not set up to do that. It's set up to take and exploit. It's not set up to create and innovate. And so we're headed towards an economy in which we have basically a controlled economy, less freedom. I'm not suggesting this is going to change. I'm suggesting you've got to start admitting that's what's happening, and you got to cope with it. You have to cope with it in your decision making, and there are ways to cope with it. Wishing it'll come back and thinking you can vote for somebody that's going to turn it around, I think, is wishful thinking.
Let me take a step back, Ed. I want to kind of take a step back for a second, let you talk a little bit about some historical perspectives, your own in particular. And one of the things that I've always loved about you, and we're going to get back on the Gavopoly conversation and kind of take it to its natural ending and some of the solutions that you see, since if we're being faced with this Gavopoly situation, you do see some clear solutions, or at least some directions that people can go. There's no perfection for sure, but I think one of the things
I don't think there's a solution for the economy. I don't think there's a problem. This is just what it does. I think there are some things that people can do as individuals to cope with it as it evolves and changes, but I'm certainly not suggesting a change in the economy. I think this is just what it does. There's nothing to fix. This is what it does. Just like people, they get born, they grow, they mature, and then they die. That's the way it happens. And so you just have to learn to cope with things.
Well, you just made my point for where I wanted to go, which is, and correcting me on language. One of the things that I've always learned from you and admired from you is the clear thinking. And I always, when I try to respond to people, if I'm doing an interview or something in an online forum, I try to stay clear. I try to be as objective as I can. You are exceptionally good at this, and especially when people look at your writings, they can see it's very, very clear. How did you start to have this type of clear thinking as an individual, or was this something that you felt always as a young man, and it's been with you your whole life? How did you develop this way to look at the world clearly?
Well, thank you. It's a struggle for me. I'm thinking about it a lot, and I always think, wow, I could have said that. I could have said that better. I'll probably hear this interview and I'll say, oh man, that's pretty lame. I do a lot of writing and rewriting, and I've always done that. And I try to think about something until it gets simple. And if it's complicated, I figure, well, I don't understand it yet. So one of the things I do is I just think about things till they get simple. And then they're easy to explain, and then they're pretty clear. And I've had some mentors in my life that have been sticklers. Jay Forrester, for one, absolutely unforgiving about any misuse of English or anything. Any equations, they ought to be annotated, and the units of measure had to match, and you just couldn't get away with anything. And so I developed that. I just developed that habit. I've developed this to such an extent that I have a language that goes with it, SVOP, which subject, verb, object, keep it in the present tense. That's a way that helps sort it out if I find myself straying from that grammatical convention. I figure I don't understand something. Anything that's clear fits into that linguistic format. So I'm on this, and I enjoy it. It's just I probably take it to extreme. It's not it's not a good strategy socially. It's socially, people are very metaphoric, and they're very inaccurate, and they just say what they feel, and you've got to decipher their feelings and so forth. So I don't recommend this as a social method, but as far as thinking and trying to get logical answers, it's pretty good.
I was wondering maybe if you would go a little bit further on Jay Forrester. And for those that don't know, very well-known MIT professor, systems dynamics. And I think Jay is still with us. He's like 96, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And prior to publishing my book, I went and visited with him, and I included him, some things on him in the book. Amazing person. He, at one point, held a patent on the core memory for computers, enabling some of the first of the world in computer. He was behind that. He was inventor of the radar positioning system, which was a servo control mechanism. And then he went on and applied servo control thinking to business situations and developed a modeling language, invented the whole field of system dynamics. To really understand how systems work, I think requires a lot of training. I think it's imperative to have some kind of an engineering background, preferably electrical engineering, preferably servo dynamics, to understand how systems work. So there's a whole field, and he pioneered it, and this is an amazing guy.
I'm working on a project right now, and I was reading a couple of his white papers recently, and it's I can see how he influenced you on the clear thinking, because his white papers are just crystal clear. It's fun to read them because it's just there's no beating around the bush. It's all just direct. And it's understandable too. It's not an academic treatise. It's something that you can sit down and start to digest.
He would go to conferences on economics, and there would be a panel, and then they would have comments, and he would point out that a certain speaker in his speech had contradicted himself several times. And he would listen. He would really listen to what people say, and he would think about it. And then if it wasn't accurate, he wasn't shy about saying so.
No, like I said, I think for the audience out there not familiar, checking out your Trading Tribe website at edsakota.com, they could definitely get an understanding of, if they're not familiar with what you and I are talking about right now, they will definitely start to understand how you handle your FAQs, your frequently asked questions. But that's a completely different subject. Let me
go ahead. On the topic of getting things exactly right, I want to point out that's Sakota.com, not edsakota.com, SEYKOTA.com. Edsakota goes somewhere else. Yeah, and so do I, but the website is Sakota.com.
Ed, let me get back into the notion of Gavopoly for a second. So we've got this system that's operating, and as you kind of say, it's doing as it should. You are observing and you're describing it, but it's not a pretty conclusion to when the 39th day and the duckweed races across the pond. It's not a pretty conclusion, but I think what's tough when you look at the media and the political systems, everybody has a fix. If you vote for me, I can fix it. I've got this platform. The media says if we do this, we can fix it. If we watch this TV show, if we get upset about this issue, and I'm just as guilty as some people to get upset about things, but it's all seems to be one big dog and pony show. But if we get back to your modeling of the Gavopoly system, the dog and pony show just distracts us, but the system marches on.
Well, the dog and pony show is part of the system. The dog and pony show is purposefully orchestrated to distract people from the real issues. Nobody talks about the real engine behind this is the growth of the Gavopoly system and the fact that it has unlimited access to money. In my model, I've even tried to, even if you eliminate borrowing for the government and you reduce regulations at this point, it would take 20 or 30 years of austerity to get any meaningful change to get us back to a free competition society. You're not going to get anybody elected on a 30-year austerity program in which the government decides that they're not going to borrow money anymore. That's just not going to happen. So nobody's even talking about this, or nobody's even interested in it. The real issue about how the economy works and how debt works and how deficit spending works and bailouts and all the rest of that, those are just kind of accepted, and no one is concerned about it. What they're concerned about is there's a race riot, or there's police, or someone thinks the police are being too brutal, or one race group is beating up on another race group, or there's people coming across the border or not coming across the border. So we're talking about fixing things that are all symptoms, but nobody. There's a couple politicians. I don't care to name any of them, but there's a couple of them that try to talk about the real issues. They always get marginalized, and they don't even make the final cut in the political race. And what you have is the distinction between political parties is fairly obscure at this point. They're all voting for expansion of the duopoly system. They want to make this. The system is now in its final phases, where it's taking over. There's no way to resist it. There's no way to stop it. I don't recommend spending a lot of time worrying about it. It's like a patient, or if you had a friend that was dying of terminal cancer. Well, what do? You try to make the best of the time you have, but you don't spend a lot of time trying to fix it. There's nothing to fix. Or someone is just dying. There's nothing to fix. We're making a transition, or a caterpillar turns into a butterfly and is a change in form. There's nothing to fix. It's how it works. You don't have to use death metaphors, just a transformation metaphor. The economy is transforming from what used to be a free competition, innovative society. It's now transforming into a very controlled society. This is a transition. It's natural. It happens time and time again to all societies. There's a cycle. It goes back and forth, and there's the duopoly system grows until it finally renders the host society inoperable, and then it collapses, and then it starts over again. This is a long-term cycle. You don't find any currencies around that are more than a couple hundred years old. And if you had invested one penny at the birth of Christ, at year zero, or whatever year you want to make the difference between BC and AD back then, that one penny growing at nominal interest rates of a couple percent would be more than all the money in the world. So you say, well, how can that be? Because there certainly was a penny, and there certainly was ways to invest, and how come nobody has done that? Well, because you earn a lot of money, and then you get these periodic resets in the money. So nobody's able to accumulate money for very long, because the money eventually goes worthless. And that's also part of the design. And you have hard money for a while. You have gold or sticks or some other tokens of exchange, cattle or whatever you have. And then you go off into currency, and then you get bankers decide they can loan out money, because not everybody's going to come and get the money at the same time. And then you get fractional reserve banking, and then you get a federal or a central bank, and then you get excesses, and you get huge bubbles, like having bubbles much more frequent and much larger bubbles now. And eventually the bubbles are just going to dominate, and every bubble becomes more severe than the last one.
Ed, I think for some people listening, I could see some in the audience already building up a criticism in their mind. And I think what people need to understand is that you're not, some people might be thinking, oh, Ed Seykota, he sounds bearish, or he sounds like a doom and gloomer. Whereas you are taking a very distinct perspective to where, like, look, I'm observing the system as it is. I'm not, you're very clear about it. You're saying, you can't really worry about it. You can't stop it. And I think, and you're not trying to make a prediction of the timing of something. You're just objectively trying to analyze the economy that we all are in the middle of.
Yeah, I'm not saying anything wrong with it. I think this is the way it works. That's basically what we do in the trading tribe, is we look at, how can we be more effective as people in coping with the environment? If you'd been around 100 years ago, or maybe back in the early 1800s, a whole different economy. You want to get out there and build machines, start factories, and hire people and participate in the greatest economic miracle ever. These days it's different. It's a different, and there certainly are pockets of innovation. There are very bright people coming up with whole new industries. And you got drones flying around that we didn't have before, and lots of advances. So there certainly are people innovating, but by and large, a lot of people are out of work, and you have a huge dependent class, and you have a huge amount of moral hazard in the economic system, and you have a disconnect between our governance and people. People don't even believe what the politicians are telling them anymore. So you have a whole different economy and a whole different society, and it's just part of the evolution. And you can find all kinds of books about what we ought to do to fix things. I don't think there's anything to fix. I think it's just how it works. And there's always people that think we should fix things. It's one of the symptoms of this transition we're going through, is there's people that want to, go out there in the fall and pick up the leaves and glue them back on the trees because they liked it better in the spring when the leaves were green and on the trees. But you can't glue the leaves back on the trees. You just have to accept the fall for the beauty that's there and move with it. So that's what we do in the trading tribe, is we try to, what can we do with our own attitudes and our own responses to cope with whatever the flow is, not try to change things, pretend they're different. What can we do to go with the flow? In other words, to use trend following in our own personal lives.
I know you look at trend following from not only from a trading perspective, but your own life perspective.
Yeah, and I think if you're going to really be a trend follower, you're going to have a lot of trouble limiting it to one area, because let's say you have a trend following system. You say, well, okay, I'm gonna have a diversified portfolio, a trend following portfolio. So I'm going to free myself up from emotions. Emotions have always been the big problem here. So I'm going to have a diversified trend following portfolio, or I'm going to invest in somebody else's portfolio, and that's going to fix this emotional problem. And then what happens? Well, their investment or their portfolio goes up and down. And then I've got emotional problems with that. So you don't really fix your emotions by having a system. What you do is you just move them upstream. You move them upstream instead of, you have constituents within the portfolio that used to bother you and they went up and down. And then now you have a portfolio that goes up and down. You just move the problem upstream. So ultimately you have to say, well, what is it that I'm feeling, and what do I do when I feel these things, and can I come up with better and more useful or productive ways of responding when the thing goes up and down? And eventually you've got to come to terms with that. And so the best trend followers, I think, are the ones that have made peace with themselves and have said, well, this is what I do in the case of things going up and down. The value increasing and decreasing. This is how I behave, and this is how I act. And of course, as you know, there are all kinds of things you can do when things go up. Some people, when something goes up, they sell them. Some people, when things go up, they buy. And when they keep going up, some people sell more and some people buy more. And if you go to extreme in either of those cases, you're counterproductive, self-destructive. You've got to know how to do that, and you've got to do it consistently. You've got to do it in your personal life. I think if you do these things in your personal life as well, it supports a trend following. Because if you're not in alignment between your overall philosophy and how you behave as a person, and you try to do trend following, well, there's going to be conflicts. And so we in trading tribe, we hardly ever talk about actual trading or what the markets are doing. What we're working with is the emotional reaction to volatility, or emotional reaction to loss, or to structure or authority, or all these other issues. People straighten these things out. Their relationships with their significant others and their children get better. They report more satisfaction in all areas of life. And incidentally, their trading is getting better, and they don't quite know how that happened, but it's just that they've turned into a person that now can cope with uncertainty, and can cope with volatility, and they couldn't do it before. And you can't, in my opinion, you can't take a system and use that to medicate your feelings. You've got to get your feelings. Some people say, well, I'm just going to suppress my feelings, a stiff upper lip approach, or grin and bear it, or clench your teeth and hope for the best. I tend to go the other way. You try to say, what's the positive intention of these feelings? Celebrate them, find out the positive intention, and as soon as you do that, the feeling disappears and you go on to the next feeling. So I'm more of the go with the flow on the feelings as well. So there's a lot of different approaches. But by now, after we've been doing this a couple decades, we're developing a body of knowledge of how to do this, and to what extent can we actually reprogram response patterns. We're getting pretty good at this. As we've got, and you can follow what we're doing. I put it all on the blog at Trading Tribe, at tradingtribe.com. All this is free if people want to go on there and look at it. And we're documenting the growth of all kinds of people who are using this technology, and it seems to be, to the extent they use it, it seems to be working pretty well for them.
It always just seems like to me that the place that one is trying to find is just some peace and contentment. And there's this just, again, I start off with giving you the praise of the clear thinking. I think that's to just be able to sit in a room and not feel, I mean, you're not to have this anxiety and worrying constantly. And if one has that, to work on that. And I think it's just trying to find it. I see a lot of parallels to your work and some of the meditation. I read some of the Zen scholars like Alan Watts. It seems like there's some commonalities with some of your work and the Eastern thought process.
I believe every feeling has a positive intention. For instance, if you're in a house and you smell smoke, you hear crackling sounds, and notice the temperature going up in the room, and you conclude that maybe the house is on fire, that would be a really good time to feel anxiety and to take some action in response to it. So I'm not so sure that you want to, medicate your mind, anesthetize yourself, and put yourself into some meditative state where you don't respond. That's not really what I'm saying. I think you want to notice the feeling you're having in the moment and act appropriately. And you want to learn the difference between medicating a feeling and responding to it proactively. So it's not always, I'm not suggesting you always aim towards peacefulness. Sometimes you want to get busy. You might want to get busy and put a trade on, or you might want to get busy and take some corrective action, some risk control, or you might want to take some action and get into some opportunity. But whatever it is, I think you can learn to come into harmony with your feelings. And to some extent, it's nice to just be able to be peaceful and watch your feelings and watch your mind and rest. It's important to rest particularly when you feel tired. But I don't recommend using either Trading Tribe technology, which I call TTP, Trading Tribe process, using that or anything else for medicinal purposes, like a drug or alcohol or a sedative. You have to watch out. There's a difference between using any of these technologies as a sedative, and I don't think any of the Zen masters really recommend blissing out and staying there permanently. I think they want to be responsive and proactive to whatever feeling arises in the moment.
I love the constant learning. What's the better way to handle expressing oneself? What's the better way there's always a better way to do it, right?
Well, I think so. I think I try. We're here in the moment, and I'm learning something. Learning something from you, and I'm trying to be responsive. And I'll think about this later, and I'll say, "Oh man, and now I really could have said that better." But that's how life is. I do the best I can in the moment, and then go back and maybe do it differently next time, and try to learn. And study my responses and say, well, can I change the response? And then that's what we do in a trading tribe. We try to look at what our responses are to our feelings, and then we practice identifying, well, what is it we are doing? How are we getting the result we're getting? And can we change our response patterns and get different results next time around?
The only way you can learn is to extend yourself to perhaps in front of somebody that has more experience. And once you extend yourself, there's the chance that you might be forced to learn something that makes you feel like, wow, why did I just say it that way? I could have said it the way he just told me. But you want to get to the point of knowing the better way until you extend yourself with the wrong way.
Yeah, we find in the right environment, and we take a lot of care to set up the environment correctly. Once you set up an environment in which the goal is for people to help each other improve, I think this is true in the trading tribe, and some companies have this down pretty well too, some other organizations, where when personal growth becomes important, then when people correct you or offer advice, you say, thank you. Thank you for helping me learn something. In a lot of situations, somebody will correct you or give you advice, and then you get upset about it, and you may say something to protect yourself, or put them down, or swear at them, or tell them to keep their distance, or whatever. So it's a different environment where everyone is trying to grow and do a better job, and that's another thing we had. When you have an expansive economy and a company that's growing, and everybody's trying to do better, then the culture in that company, when you have growth, when you have a free competition society and free competition, you have a competitive startup firm, and somebody says to somebody else, there's a better way to do this, then they say, thank you for telling me, and they start doing it that way. When you get a survival company, one that's overly restrictive and political, and there's regulations, you better mind your own business and don't go talking to somebody else about what they should be doing. You see the whole environment, the whole structure. The environment in one case is pro personal growth and pro learning, and the other one is not. It's very territorial and very defensive. You can walk into companies, you can sense this right away. Some are open to grow, and then they get mature, and then if they start getting kind of the Gavopoly model, and they start going the other way, and they don't want to have, you offer advice at your own risk.
Ed, one of the things that you do in the Gavopoly book and your premise is you talk about the strategy of trend following. And I don't want to phrase it as a solution, but you offer trend following as a way to perhaps, a better phrasing is to cope with as we move towards this Gavopoly system that you see as inevitable. And trend following is, and perhaps there's other solutions, and I'd love to hear if you think there are, but as you talk about trend following as one kind of a way to cope, I would love for you to go back in time a little bit, if you will, and because you've had an interesting career, you've had some interesting mentors, interesting students, but I know, and I mentioned this in my email, there's a couple traders in your early years that I think had a really strong influence on you. And I would love for you to share a little bit of wisdom or perhaps experience or thoughts or memories about two gentlemen in particular, if you wouldn't mind. And that'd be Amos Hofstadter and Richard Donchian. And Amos Hofstadter, he was at Commodities Corporation, and Richard Donchian at Hayden Stone, just two very accomplished early pioneers in the field of trend following. Would you share some wisdom?
I'll be glad to share what I know. I knew Donchian a lot better than Hofstadter, and Donchian had noticed this system. He noticed the 2-week rule in copper 2-week rule, meaning you buy something when it makes highs for 2 weeks and you sell it when it makes lows for 2 weeks. And he just noticed this somehow, and he didn't remember exactly how he noticed it. I asked him once, how'd you come up with a 2-week rule? And he said, I don't exactly know, and you're the first person that's ever asked. He said he just kind of came up with it, as far as I can remember. And that was the start of the start of automated trend following was when he came up to the 2-week rule. And before that, you can look at some of Livermore's writings, and he had a system of pivot points and so forth. And there's other people that have talked about it. He basically started the 2-week rule. Now that won't work today. Back then you didn't have, you had a little different character of the markets. And the 2-week rule used to work in copper. And then we found that you had to lengthen those, and maybe you make the weeks longer, 6 weeks or sometimes now they got 30 or 40, 50 weeks or much more than that. He had this system, and then he had a couple followers there in his office. He came up with a system. He didn't always follow it himself, but he had this system, and he had people on it, and he had people that were religiously following the system, and they seemed to do pretty well. And I came along, and I studied his rule set. He had Donchin's rules and Donchin's guidelines. And about that time, we had computers were starting to become within reach of people to use them. Although they didn't have personal computers, they did have mainframes at some companies. And I got, if you can believe this, I got to go into the major brokerage house at the time on